Después de las conferencias, paneles y mensajes que hemos tenido el día de hoy, es claro que las finanzas sustentables tienen una relevancia creciente y cada vez más presente en los mercados a nivel internacional. Por esta razón, nuestro Premier Partner y patrocinador para este evento, S&P Dow Jones Indices, nos trae una conferencia acerca de índices e indicadores ASG, otorgada por Margaret Dorn, quien es Senior Director, Head of ESG Indices en la región de Norteamérica para S&P Dow Jones Indices. Muchísimas gracias, Maggie. Bienvenida a este evento.
Wonderful. Well, first and foremost, thank you to the CCFV for inviting me to speak today. And thank you to the audience for joining me for what I hope will be both a timely and relevant discussion around the impacts of climate change and how those impacts ultimately are affecting both investor preferences as well as investment strategies. So I guess just to set the stage for today, I thought I would share a quote from the UN Secretary General in response to the most recent report by the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that I'm sure many of you are already very well aware of or very familiar with. But the findings in the report around the impacts of climate change were in fact so dire that he called the report a code red for humanity, that the alarm bells are deafening and that the evidence is refutable. It was both a bold as well as a decisive statement that caught the attention of governments and policymakers and even investors all over the world. So with that statement in mind, I thought we could discuss a bit further what is some of the evidence that the UN Secretary General was referring to around climate change, and what are some of the impacts that climate change could have or potentially have, not only on the global economy, but on the day-to-day lives of global citizens as well. So if we look at January of 2020, global land and ocean surface temperatures were recorded at its highest levels in 141 years. And they were recorded at 1.14 degrees Celsius above the 20th century average. And at this point, there's really very few climate scientists who would dispute that the Earth's climate is rapidly warming, primarily due to human activity, with these catastrophic potential impacts. So as a result, many governments and policymakers and even individuals are really committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, with the ultimate goal now not only to really limit global temperature increases to well below that 2 degrees Celsius target that was initially set by the landmark Paris Agreement in 2015, but they're taking this a step further to really limit the increase to less than the 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming since pre-industrial levels that has ultimately been recommended by the IPCC. So indeed, what we're seeing is that these climate models, similar to what you see on this slide, really reveal kind of this ominous, not what we call non-linear relationship between greenhouse gas emissions and what we call several climate tipping points, which could dramatically and irreversibly cause these effects around the world. So if you take, for example, 1 to 3 degrees Celsius of warming, that anywhere between 1 to 3 degrees Celsius of warming could melt or could potentially melt the entire Greenland ice sheets. And that melting of the Greenland ice sheet could trigger a reversal in Atlantic Ocean currents, amounting to sea level rise and heat accumulation in the Southern Ocean. And ultimately, what that could do is trigger further ice loss from the East Antarctic ice sheet as well. So to put that into context, if you were to look at the melting of both that Greenland ice sheet as well as the East Antarctic ice sheet, they both hold enough water to raise global sea levels nearly 40 feet, which would ultimately lead to the sinking of many of the world's greatest coastal cities. So the IPCC recently warned that at these sustained global warming levels between 2 degrees and 3 degrees Celsius, those ice sheets could melt irreversibly for thousands of years until they're almost entirely gone, which could ultimately condemn future generations to massive, relentless sea level rise for centuries to come. So, and this gets even worse if you look at higher levels of global warming, in which we could see even more severe consequences of this nature. So moving on, if you think about the human implications of these complex and unprecedented interactions, they really are potentially disastrous. So with a rise of 2 degrees Celsius, significantly more people will likely face things like reduced crop yields, habitat degradation, heat wave exposure, hydroclimate risk to power production, in even water stress than that of a 1.5 degree warming scenario. So what this is ultimately telling us is that just that additional half of a degree or 0.5 of a degree of warming between that 1.5 and 2 degree scenario could have exponentially more devastating human consequences, let alone if we even look at this at those higher warming scenarios. So it really begs the question around, what trajectory are we on? And is it aligned with that 1.5 degree scenario? And, in the absence of both collective and corrective action, global warming is expected to reach anywhere between 4.1 to 4.8 degrees Celsius above those pre-industrial levels by the end of this century. So warming of 4 degrees has long been deemed kind of this worst case scenario. And even the World Bank once bluntly concluded that 4 degrees simply must not be allowed to occur. Now, if you were to take, or if you can take a more of an optimistic picture, and that's what the climate tracker has provided here in this chart, is that, companies have started doing more to restrain their emissions. So both companies and countries have really started to do more to restrain their emissions. So that's painting a bit of a more optimistic picture. Now, if you look at this graphic, what you see is that current policies put the world on pace for roughly about a 2.9 degrees Celsius of warming by 2100. But that, there really is this fact that just that modest estimate really falls in this, what could be a potential range between 2.1 degrees and 3.9 degrees Celsius. So ultimately, where we fall in that range, or if we're able to accomplish that very ambitious target of 1.5 degrees, will depend on the behavior of not only governments, but policymakers, as well as market participants that are really looking to transform the status quo and ultimately radically transition to a lower carbon economy. So with that in mind, this past month, those same policymakers and governments and market participants had a chance to really address some of these challenges really head on at the crucial COP26 climate conference in Glasgow. And I think that the expectation was that all nations, really especially those advanced G20 economies, would ultimately commit to the net zero emissions coalition and reinforce some of their earlier promises on slowing down and reversing global warming. And the hope was that they would do this by really putting forth both credible as well as concrete steps towards achieving these goals. And while there's some criticism and some believe that COP26 could have gone further, in many respects, it did in fact bring us closer to a 1.5 degree world. And some of the more impactful actions that were taken or that were agreed upon at COP26 are listed here on this slide. So it's just really taking a look at what happened at COP26 in terms of the numbers. So, 20 plus countries and 5 development banks committed to end public financing overseas of fossil fuel projects by the end of 2022. There were 77 signatories, including 46 countries that pledged to phase out coal-fired generation in the coming decades. I won't read them through them all, but there were numerous, quantifiable commitments and objectives that were made at COP26. But given some of these outcomes out of COP26, it is quite clear that there's been this really increased sense of urgency to achieve that goal of net zero emissions by 2050. And in order to accomplish that longer term goal, the shorter term goals needed to achieve that really critical target will require the collective power beyond just that of policymakers alone. And what we're seeing is that this, collective power is translating into this growing ecosystem of stakeholders. And these stakeholders include any entity from asset owners. And we've seen that in the creation of the Asset Owner Alliance, or we're now seeing the involvement of more and more financial institutions. And they've then created that GFANZ Alliance. And now even more increasingly so, investors are also rapidly becoming a critical piece of the puzzle and are committed to aligning their portfolios or investments with a scenario that will ultimately help to mitigate the most catastrophic climate impacts and ultimately help them to embark on their own journey towards net zero. So all of that being said, clearly climate has never been higher on an investor's agenda. And I think we've seen, quite a shift in overall investor sentiment, and that has translated into really exponential growth of both, green, or more broadly speaking, climate focused funds over the past several years. So one of the most recent figures that I came across is that assets invested in these funds have actually grown to well over 200 billion in US dollars. And while that may seem, relatively insignificant in the grand scheme of things, that number actually represents close to 10 times the growth over the past several years. So we've seen 10 times growth in those climate and green focused funds over the past few years. Now, one thing to be mindful of when we're using terms like green or climate focused solutions or strategies is that they can encompass a lot of different things and a wide array of climate solutions and strategies. But if you think about that point, as we've seen this uptick in interest and an uptick in assets into these types of climate strategies, we've also really seen an evolution in terms of what climate conscious investors are looking to achieve within their portfolios. And so, what I mean by this, and I've provided a little snapshot of kind of the historical evolution or timeline of a climate focused investor. But again, getting back to what I mean by that evolution for a climate conscious investor, it had historically largely focused on reducing relative portfolio carbon exposure. And oftentimes what that translated to was just kind of a simple solution like a low carbon index that really aimed to reduce the carbon footprint of an index or a strategy. But I think more recently, what we're seeing is that those investors' needs have evolved. And there's really this increasing interest and demand to address climate change more holistically in their portfolios. And so that really begs the question, what is driving that evolution? And I think to some degree, it can be narrowed down to 2 really critical points that are ultimately really fueling kind of this investor shift to reorient their capital flows into these more holistic climate solutions. So first and foremost, again, I think investors are looking to address really all key dimensions of climate change. So not only are they just looking at the risks, like things like transition risks and physical risk, but they're also looking to capture the opportunities. And those opportunities exist in things like greener technologies and other greener business solutions that will really be needed to achieve these net zero targets by 2050. So investors are really looking for the ability, to capture an alignment with that 1.5 degree pathway that will ultimately be linked to their own net zero commitment. And one of the reasons that we're really now able to capture this alignment for an investor has been the very recent developments of groundbreaking new data sets, like our own True Cost Paris alignment data set, as well as these really innovative index construction approaches that are now much more equipped to address a number of different climate objectives. So I think the other key consideration here that's really driving interest and awareness are the climate benchmark regulations that are coming out of Europe or the EU, which have really also driven, adoption by a wider set of investors. And we see that general adoption and the impact with regards to those regulations trickling down to other countries and regions really around the world. So in an effort to address both of these key points for investors, at S&P, we recently launched the S&P Pact indices. So that's just a short way of saying we've launched these two very robust and unique climate aligned and index strategies, which are called the S&P Paris aligned Net Zero 2050 indices and the S&P Climate Transition Net Zero 2050 indices. And again, these indices really aim to address climate change more holistically and capture all key dimensions of climate change, including those mandated by the benchmark regulations, but do all of this whilst really keeping kind of a comprehensive approach in order to provide a solution that is both relevant to investors that are committing to a net zero investment approach. So from an investor's perspective, the S&P Pact indices really provide a formidable new toolkit for really adhering to our collective pact, right? So we're all really in this together. It's a collective pact as investors to transitioning to that 1.5 degree world. So, what we know is that investors and other market participants will really play a critical role when it comes to financing a low carbon transition. But looking forward, there are challenges and additional challenges that must be addressed to really complete the whole picture. And one such area is the role that nature or biodiversity will play in tackling climate change as well. So really, when we're looking forward, I think it's important to understand where that intersection of climate and nature or biodiversity stands for investors as well, because currently many investors are still quite unaware of the financial risks that really stem from biodiversity loss. But what we're seeing more recently is that this natural capital or biodiversity crisis is really climbing the investors' agenda, and that's really amid some of the more kind of catastrophic natural losses. And we've seen, with the newly appointed task force on nature-related financial disclosure, or what they're for short, the TNFD, that this biodiversity loss is definitely a planetary emergency. So the TNFD, or the Task Force on Natural-Related Financial Disclosure, was launched this past June. And their aim is actually to deliver by 2023 a framework for companies and other organizations to report and act on evolving nature-related risks. And why this is such a critical piece of the puzzle is that direct emissions and this destruction of nature are continuously reinforcing each other. So biodiversity loss, for example, affects the climate by changing carbon and nitrogen and water cycles. And then that couples that into destroying forests to clear land for agriculture and urban development, which also releases a vast amount of previously stored CO2, which further heats the air, the land, the oceans. And then that warming in turn triggers more droughts and wildfires and killing of plants and animals. And these warmer seas hurt corals and other marine life. So these are all very much interconnected. So restoring nature is also really indispensable to tackling the climate problem. And we've begun to see, as I mentioned earlier, that momentum behind these nature-based strategies has really begun to accelerate in recent months. And I think that was really only further enhanced by some of the nature-related pledges and targets that were also highlighted at COP26. But really what remains an issue is that there do remain some data shortcomings that continue to really challenge this space, especially as it relates to capturing data around these nature-specific or biodiversity-specific criteria that is both financially material and relevant. But at S&P, this really is an area of importance and focus, not only from a data perspective, but also how that data could then be applied within an innovative index construction or strategy. So moving forward, I think there will be this increasing focus by investors towards not only being climate neutral, but also being nature positive. And I think we'll see a lot of data and a lot of strategies for investors to ultimately look towards, again, completing the whole picture around climate change. Now, I know I've covered a lot of ground in the past 15 minutes or so, but again, I do want to thank everyone in the audience for participating, allowing me to speak to you all today. And thank you to the CCFE for allowing me to speak as well. And I hope you've enjoyed the presentation.